At 8:43 p.m. in his marble foyer, billionaire Brandon Marks watches his nonverbal daughter speak her first word to a woman who shouldn't know how to reach her. The word "mommy" escapes 4-year-old Lila's lips as she clings to Kendra, the new nanny who arrived just 12 weeks ago. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they've been hiding the truth? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Tonight, a billionaire father learns that the woman caring for his daughter has been carrying a secret for 8 years. One that connects to the night his wife died. Have you ever wondered if the people closest to you are exactly who they claim to be? The birth certificate Kendra places on his desk bears a name that will shatter everything Brandon believed about his late wife, his daughter, and the woman now standing before him. But what happens when love, lies, and loyalty collide in a mansion where nothing is as it seems? Follow along as we uncover a mystery that's been buried for decades. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. She spoke her first word at 8:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, and it wasn't Daddy. It was a name that made the richest man in Connecticut question everything he thought he knew about his own life. What would you do if your child's first word revealed a secret that could destroy your life? Brandon Marks stood frozen in the doorway of his marble foyer, watching his 4-year-old daughter do something impossible. Lila sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her small hands reaching up to touch the face of the woman kneeling beside her. "Mommy," Lila whispered again, the word barely audible but crystal clear. The woman, Kendra, didn't pull away. She didn't correct the child or look confused. Instead, she cupped Lila's face with gentle hands and nodded. Brandon's chest tightened. His daughter hadn't spoken a single word since the car accident 4 years ago. Not one sound beyond crying. Every specialist, every therapist, every expensive expert had failed. Yet here she was, talking to a nanny who'd only been in their lives for 12 weeks. The marble foyer stretched like a cathedral around them, crystal chandeliers casting broken light across walls worth more than most people's homes. But in this moment, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing, Brandon felt poorer than he had in 20 years. "What's happening here?" His voice came out sharper than intended. Kendra looked up slowly, her dark eyes calm despite the chaos around them. She wore a fitted black dress that hugged her curves in ways that made Brandon notice things he shouldn't. The graceful line of her neck as she whispered to his daughter. The way her professional composure only made him more aware of the woman beneath the nanny uniform. "She's having a breakthrough," Kendra said, her Louisiana accent barely there but unmistakable. The house staff had gathered in the hallway. Maria, the housekeeper, James, the driver, Dr. Patel, who'd come for Lila's evening session. They all stared like they were witnessing a miracle. And maybe they were. Brandon stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble. "Lila, sweetheart." His daughter turned toward him, her green eyes bright for the first time in months. "Daddy," she said, and his knees nearly gave out. 2 words. After 4 years of silence, his little girl had spoken 2 words. "Ow," he managed. Kendra stood gracefully, smoothing her dress. At 5'7", she met his gaze directly, unintimidated by his height or his wealth, or the way he was looking at her like she held all the answers in the world. "Children speak when they feel safe," she said simply. But there was something in her tone, something that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Something that made his skin feel electric despite the cool air conditioning. Have you ever heard something that instantly changed your understanding of reality? When was the last time a single word shifted your entire world? Tell me in the comments what that moment was like for you. Brandon's phone buzzed. A text from his head of security. "Sir, the cameras caught everything. Do you want us to review the footage?" Of course they had cameras. This was a $15 million estate in Fairfield County. Every corner was monitored, every moment recorded. But somehow the idea of watching this scene again felt like a violation. "Dr. Patel," Brandon called to the behavioral therapist. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" The elderly man shook his head, amazement clear on his face. In 30 years of practice, never so sudden, never so natural. Natural. That's exactly what it had looked like. Like Lila and Kendra had done this before. Like they shared some connection that went deeper than the 12 weeks since Kendra had walked into their lives. Brandon studied the nanny more carefully. She was beautiful. That much was obvious. Smooth brown skin, full lips, eyes that seemed to see everything. But it was her confidence that drew him. The way she moved through his world like she belonged there. Most people were intimidated by his money, his success, his reputation as one of the youngest billionaires in tech. Kendra treated him like he was just another employer. It should have annoyed him. Instead, it fascinated him. "Lila, baby, can you say something else?" he asked, crouching down to his daughter's level. She looked at Kendra, then back at him. "Home," she said clearly. Brandon's throat tightened. This house had never felt like home to any of them. It was a monument to his success, a fortress against the world, a place to hide from memories of a life they'd lost. But somehow, in the past 3 months, something had changed, or someone had changed it. "Mr. Marks," Kendra said, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling between them. "We need to talk. Tonight." The way she said it made clear this conversation had been coming from the moment she walked through his door. Like she'd been waiting for this exact moment, this breakthrough, this question he was finally ready to ask. Around them, the staff began to disperse, whispering among themselves about miracles and answered prayers. Dr. Patel packed his briefcase, shaking his head in wonder. Maria wiped tears from her eyes. But Brandon couldn't look away from Kendra, from the woman who'd somehow given his daughter back her voice. "My office," he said. "After Lila's asleep." She nodded once, then scooped his daughter into her arms like she weighed nothing. "Come on, sweet girl. Let's get you ready for bed." As they headed up the spiral staircase, Lila's small voice drifted back down. "Night-night, Daddy." 3 words now. 3 impossible, perfect words from a child who hadn't spoken since her mother died. Brandon stood alone in his marble foyer, surrounded by luxury and silence, knowing that everything was about to change. Again, the Atlanta agency specialized in impossible cases. Children who couldn't be reached, families who'd given up hope. What they didn't tell their clients was that sometimes the perfect nanny had her own reasons for taking the job. Brandon sat in the leather chair across from Mrs. Chun, the agency director, feeling like he was applying for something instead of hiring someone. The Buckhead office gleamed with understated elegance, Italian leather chairs, Persian rugs, oil paintings that probably cost more than most people's cars. But he barely noticed the luxury. All he saw was the file folder that might contain his daughter's salvation. "Mr. Marks," Mrs. Chun said, her voice professionally warm, "given your daughter's unique challenges, we have one candidate who stands out." Unique challenges. That's what they called it when your 4-year-old daughter witnessed her mother die in a car crash and hadn't spoken since. When every therapist, every specialist, every expert you could buy had failed to reach her. "Tell me about her." Mrs. Chin opened the folder with practiced precision. "Kendra Washington, 34 years old, originally from Louisiana, but she's been working with our agency for 6 years. Her success rate with traumatized children is remarkable." She slid a photograph across the mahogany desk. Brandon's breath caught. The woman in the picture was stunning, not in the polished way of the socialites he knew, but with a natural beauty that seemed to glow from within. Dark eyes that looked like they held secrets, full lips curved in a slight smile. Skin the color of cafe au lait, smooth and flawless. But it was her expression that grabbed him. Confident without being arrogant. Intelligent without being cold. The kind of woman who could handle herself in any situation. "What makes her different?" he asked, trying to focus on qualifications instead of the way the photograph made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. "She has a gift," Mrs. Chin said simply. "Some people are born knowing how to reach children others have given up on. Kendra is one of those people." Brandon studied the resume. Psychology degree from Tulane. Child development certification from Emory. References from families across the Southeast, all glowing, all describing miraculous breakthroughs with difficult cases. But there were gaps, periods where she seemed to disappear from the record, then resurface months later in a different state with a different family. She moves around a lot, he observed. Mrs. Chen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Kendra prefers short-term placements. Once she's helped a child through their crisis, she likes to move on to the next case. Crisis, another euphemism for the hell his family had been living in since Elizabeth died. I'd like to meet her, of course, but I should warn you, Mr. Marks, Kendra has certain requirements. She's very particular about the family she works with. The idea that someone might reject him, might find him or his situation inadequate, should have annoyed him. Instead, it intrigued him. When you had $4 billion, very few people told you no about anything. What kind of requirements? Mrs. Chen consulted her notes. Complete autonomy with your daughter. No interference from family members. No monitoring of her methods. She also requires a separate entrance to her living quarters and a car for her personal use. Brandon raised an eyebrow. She's particular about her privacy. She's particular about her effectiveness. When you've seen the results she achieves, you understand why. An hour later, he was waiting in the same conference room when the door opened. Kendra Washington walked in like she owned the place, and Brandon understood immediately why she demanded autonomy. This wasn't a woman who took orders well. She wore a navy dress that hugged her figure perfectly, modest but impossible to ignore. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and when she moved, he caught a hint of jasmine perfume that made the air feel charged. Mr. Marks. She extended her hand for a firm handshake, her skin warm against his. I've reviewed your daughter's case. Direct. No small talk, no attempt to charm him. He liked that. And she sat across from him, crossing her legs with fluid grace. Lila's trauma is complex. Losing her mother in such a violent way, especially at such a young age, has created walls that most people can't break through. Most people. Her dark eyes met his, and he felt something shift in the air between them. I'm not most people, Mr. Marks. The confidence in her voice made his pulse quicken. What makes you different? I understand what it's like to lose everything and rebuild yourself from nothing. I know how to speak the language of pain because I've spoken it myself. There was something in her tone, a hint of vulnerability beneath the professional polish, that made him lean forward. What happened to you? For just a moment, her mask slipped. He saw a flash of something raw, something wounded, before she composed herself again. I have one condition, she said, deflecting his question. Her Louisiana accent became more pronounced, honey thick and warm. Complete autonomy with your daughter. No interference, no monitoring, no questions about my methods. The intensity in her eyes made clear this wasn't negotiable. Have you ever been so desperate for help that you'd agree to almost anything? When has trusting a stranger been your last hope? Share your experience in the comments. Brandon studied her face. Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Intelligent, determined. The kind of woman who could either save his daughter or destroy what was left of his carefully controlled world. Done, he said. As she signed the contract, he caught a glimpse of a small scar on her wrist, a thin line that looked deliberate old. When their eyes met, she pulled her sleeve down quickly. I start Monday, she said, but something in her tone suggested she'd been preparing for this moment much longer than a week. Some people are born knowing how to heal what's broken, but the best healers are usually the ones who've been shattered themselves. The Connecticut estate sprawled across 47 acres of perfect green lawns and flower beds, arranged with mathematical precision. It was the kind of place where grief had room to echo, where a little girl could disappear into corners and never be found. Brandon watched from his home office window as his new nanny stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her from the train station. Even from 3 stories up, Kendra Washington commanded attention. She moved with purpose across his driveway, her sundress flowing around her legs in the morning breeze, a single suitcase in her hand like she was ready for anything. He'd given her the guest house, a 2-bedroom cottage on the far side of the property that offered privacy and a separate entrance, just like she'd requested. Most of his staff lived off-site, but something told him Kendra would need to be closer to do whatever magic she planned to work on Lila. Magic, that's what it would take at this point. His daughter sat in the sunroom, where he'd left her 20 minutes ago, staring out at nothing, her breakfast untouched. She did that a lot, disappeared in her own world where no one could follow. Dr. Patel called it dissociation. Brandon called it heartbreaking. The doorbell rang, and he heard Maria's voice echoing through the marble halls, then footsteps on the hardwood. He should go down, make introductions, establish ground rules. Instead, he stayed at his window and watched. 5 minutes later, he saw them in the garden. Lila walked beside Kendra like they'd done this 100 times before. Not holding hands, his daughter didn't like to be touched, but close enough that he could see Kendra talking, gesturing at the roses, pointing out butterflies, acting like a child who hadn't spoken in 4 years might actually respond. Then something happened that made Brandon's breath catch. Lila smiled. It was small, barely there, but unmistakable. A real smile, not the empty expression she'd worn like a mask since the accident. He found himself moving closer to the window, his palm pressed against the glass. In the garden below, Kendra had knelt beside the fountain, her dress pooling around her on the stone path. She was showing Lila something in the water, probably the goldfish Elizabeth had insisted on keeping, fish that had somehow survived 4 years of neglect. When Kendra looked up at the house, their eyes met through the window. The distance between them collapsed into nothing. She didn't wave or smile. She just held his gaze for a long moment, and he felt something shift in his chest, something dangerous. Then Lila tugged on Kendra's dress, and the spell broke. That afternoon, he found them in the library. Lila sat curled in one of the oversized leather chairs while Kendra read aloud from a picture book, her voice animated, bringing characters to life. His daughter wasn't looking at the pages, but she was listening. Brandon could tell by the way she tilted her head, the way her small body had relaxed for the first time in months. She likes stories, Kendra said without looking up, somehow sensing his presence in the doorway. She used to. Her mother read to her every night. Kendra's hand stilled on the page. Tell me about her mother. The question hit him like a physical blow. No one asked about Elizabeth anymore. His friends, his family, his staff, they all danced around the subject like her name might summon ghosts. He struggled for words. She was the kind of person who made everything better just by being there. Lila was her world. And you? Kendra asked quietly. Were you her world too? The question was too intimate, too personal for someone who'd been in his house for 6 hours. But something in her tone made him answer honestly. I thought so. I hope so. For the first time since the accident, Lila laughed. A sound Brandon had forgotten existed, crystalline and pure, floating across the room like music from another lifetime. She was pointing at something in the book, and Kendra was laughing too, her face transformed by joy. Brandon felt tears threaten for the first time in months. That evening, after Lila had eaten more dinner than she had in weeks, after she'd let Kendra help her brush her teeth without a fight, after she'd gone to bed without the screaming that usually accompanied bedtime, Brandon found himself walking to the guest house. He told himself he was just checking in, making sure Kendra had everything she needed. But when she answered the door in jeans and a soft sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, he knew he was lying to himself. How did you do it? He asked. She leaned against the doorframe, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Do what? Make her laugh. Make her present. Every expert I've hired, every specialist, every person who claimed they could help, they all failed. You've been here one day. Maybe they were trying too hard, she said. Sometimes healing happens when you stop forcing it and start listening instead. What does it look like when someone sees potential where others see only problems? Have you ever watched someone bloom under the right kind of attention? Drop a heart if you've witnessed that kind of transformation. The night air was cool between them, but Brandon felt warm everywhere her gaze touched. She was beautiful in the porch light, soft and approachable in a way that made him forget she was his employee. Thank you, he said simply. She smiled, and it hit him like lightning. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Marks. We're just getting started. As he walked back toward the main house, he heard her voice drifting through the open windows. She was singing something soft and low, a lullaby maybe, or a song from her childhood in Louisiana. That night, for the first time in 4 years, Lila slept through the night without nightmares. And Brandon lay awake, thinking about the woman in his guest house who seemed to understand his daughter better than he did. The woman whose presence had shifted something fundamental in their broken world. The woman whose handwriting looked familiar in ways that made his chest tight with questions he wasn't ready to ask. The smart thing would have been to keep it professional. But intelligence has never been a match for the kind of chemistry that makes air feel electric. 3 weeks in, and Brandon's routine had changed completely. He found himself working from the sunroom instead of his office, taking calls on the terrace, scheduling meetings around Lila's therapy sessions with Kendra. All perfectly reasonable excuses to be wherever they were. He told himself it was parental concern. He was invested in his daughter's progress, naturally curious about the methods that were working when nothing else had. But when he caught himself watching Kendra read stories in her animated voice, studying the way she moved through his house like she belonged there, he knew he was lying to himself. The woman was dangerous to his peace of mind. She never overstepped, never flirted, never gave him any indication that she saw him as anything other than Lila's father and her employer. But there were moments when their hands brushed passing Lila's juice cup, when she looked up from braiding his daughter's hair and caught him staring, when she smiled at something Lila did, that made him forget every professional boundary he'd ever established. Tonight was one of those nights. He'd been working late in his study, wrestling with acquisition documents for a startup in Seattle, when he'd heard voices in the kitchen. Soft conversation punctuated by Lila's giggling. His daughter was supposed to be asleep by 8, but it was nearly 10, and the sound of her joy had pulled him downstairs like gravity. The kitchen glowed with warm under-cabinet lighting, all granite surfaces and copper accents that made midnight feel intimate rather than lonely. Outside, Connecticut's summer rain pressed against floor-to-ceiling windows like secrets waiting to be told. Kendra stood at the island, making what looked like hot chocolate, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing pajama pants and a tank top that clung to her curves in ways that made Brandon's mouth go dry. Lila sat on the counter beside her, swinging her legs and actually talking. Not just words anymore, full sentences. Stories about the butterflies in the garden, questions about whether fish dreamed, observations about how the rain sounded different on different windows. And then the princess decided she didn't need rescuing after all, Kendra was saying, clearly in the middle of some elaborate bedtime story. Because she was brave? Lila asked. Because she was smart. Sometimes being smart is better than being brave. Brandon cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle them, but unable to stay hidden any longer. Daddy, Lila's face lit up like Christmas morning. Kendra was telling me about the smart princess who lived in a castle made of books. A castle made of books, he repeated, moving closer to the island. That sounds like the best kind of castle. That's what I told her, Kendra said, her voice warm with amusement. When she reached for glasses on the high shelf, her tank top rode up, revealing the smooth curve of her lower back. Brandon stepped closer to help, close enough to smell her skin, something warm and clean that made his pulse quicken. Their hands touched around the glass, and the contact sent electricity shooting up his arm. She looked at him, and he saw her breath catch, saw the way her pupils dilated in the soft light. "Thank you," she said, but she didn't step away. Neither did he. "Hot chocolate?" she asked, her voice slightly breathless. "That sounds perfect." They stood too close while she poured, their shoulders brushing, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller despite its generous size. When she handed him the mug, their fingers lingered against each other longer than necessary. "You're good with her," Brandon said, his voice coming out lower than intended. "It's not about being good," Kendra replied, her eyes meeting his. "It's about recognizing the hurt. Sometimes the only way to heal someone else is to understand what broke them in the first place." The words hit him harder than they should have. There was something in her tone, something personal and raw, that made him want to ask questions he had no right to ask. "What broke you?" he said instead, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She went very still, the mug halfway to her lips. For a moment, he saw something vulnerable flicker across her face. Pain, maybe, or old fear. Then she glanced at Lila, who who was dozing against the cabinet, and the moment passed. "We should get her to bed," she said, deflecting his question with practiced ease. But as she scooped Lila into her arms, as they walked together up the stairs to his daughter's room, as they tucked her in with the kind of easy cooperation that felt dangerously domestic, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that he'd glimpsed something important. Some piece of the puzzle that was Kendra Washington. When they returned to the kitchen, the hot chocolate had gone cold, but neither of them moved to leave. "She's talking more every day," he said, desperate to fill the silence that was crackling with tension. "Trauma heals on its own timeline. You can't force it. Is that what happened to you? Trauma that healed on its own timeline." She set down her mug and looked at him directly. "Mr. Marks?" "Brandon," he corrected. "When it's just us, call me Brandon." "Brandon," she said, and his name in her voice, with that slight Louisiana drawl, made something clench low in his stomach. This is complicated enough without. Without what? When was the last time someone understood your pain without you having to explain it? Have you ever felt instantly connected to someone in a way that scared and thrilled you? Share your story below. She gestured between them, at the space that felt charged with electricity. Without this, he stepped closer, drawn by something stronger than common sense. "What is this exactly?" Her eyes dropped to his mouth, then back up to his eyes. "Something that could ruin everything good I've built with Lila. Or something that could make it better." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Rain continued to hit the windows, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. Kendra took a step back, but he saw the effort it cost her. "I should go," she said. But as she moved past him toward the kitchen door, he caught her wrist gently. Not restraining, just connecting. "Kendra." She turned back, and he saw everything he felt reflected in her dark eyes. Want, need, fear. "This can't happen," she whispered, but her body betrayed her words, swaying slightly toward him. "Why not?" She pulled her wrist free, but gently, like she didn't really want to break the contact. "Because," she said, backing toward the door, "you don't know who I really am, and when you find out, you'll wish you'd kept your distance." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the kitchen with cold hot chocolate and the uncomfortable certainty that she was right. He didn't know who she really was, but God help him, he wanted to find out. She'd built her entire career on boundaries, until the night she found herself in his study at 2 a.m., wearing nothing but his shirt and all the reasons this was wrong. The storm had been building all day, pressure dropping until the air itself felt heavy with anticipation. By evening, rain lashed against the mansion's windows like nature demanding entry, and the power flickered twice before staying steady. Kendra should have been asleep in her guest house, but sleep required peace of mind, and she'd lost that somewhere around the moment Brandon looked at her in the kitchen 3 days ago. Since then, every interaction had been charged with the kind of tension that made breathing difficult. She tried to maintain distance, professional smiles instead of real ones. Conversations focused solely on Lila's progress. Eyes that looked anywhere except at the way Brandon's dress shirts stretched across his shoulders, or how he unconsciously rolled up his sleeves when he was thinking, exposing forearms that made her wonder what his skin would feel like under her hands. But tonight, restless and unable to ignore the way her body hummed with awareness every time he was near, she'd given up on sleep and decided to borrow a book from his library. The house had been dark except for a sliver of light beneath his study door. She should have walked past. Instead, she knocked. "Come in," his voice called, rough with exhaustion. The study felt like a sanctuary, all leather-bound books and amber lamplight, the kind of room where secrets could finally find voice. Brandon sat behind his mahogany desk, shirt sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, surrounded by documents and the remnants of what looked like a very long day. Thunder shook the windows as rain drummed against glass. Nature providing perfect cover for confessions whispered in the dark. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted from the doorway. He looked up, and she saw her own restlessness reflected in his eyes. "Neither could I." She was wearing pajama shorts and a thin cotton tank top. Nothing inappropriate, but somehow everything felt exposed under his gaze. The way he looked at her, like she was something precious and dangerous at the same time, made her skin warm despite the air conditioning. "I was going to get a book," she said, though they both knew that wasn't why she was here. "Help yourself." But his voice had dropped an octave, and when she moved to the bookshelf, she felt his eyes following every step. She selected something at random, poetry, maybe, or philosophy, but when she turned back, he was standing, moving around the desk toward her with purposeful steps that made her pulse race. "Kendra," he said, and her name in his voice was a question and an answer at the same time. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but she didn't move away when he stopped just inches from her. "Probably not," he agreed, but his hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her skin with reverent gentleness. The book fell from her fingers, hitting the carpet with a soft thud that seemed loud in the charged silence. "Tell me to stop," he said, but even as he spoke, he was leaning closer, his breath warm against her lips. She should have stepped back, should have remembered all the reasons this was complicated and wrong and dangerous. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him. The first kiss was tentative, questioning, both of them giving the other a chance to pull away. But when she sighed against his mouth, when her hands fisted in his shirt and pulled him closer, something broke open between them. The second kiss tasted like bourbon and promises neither should make. His hands tangled in her hair, and she traced the tension from his shoulders, amazed by the solid warmth of him, by how perfectly she fit against his body. "Are you sure?" he asked against her neck, his voice rough with want and restraint. "No," she breathed, surprising herself with honesty, "but I don't care." He lifted her easily, carrying her to the leather sofa that dominated one corner of the room. Documents scattered from the coffee table as he laid her down, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're beautiful," he said, hands tracing the curve of her waist, the line of her hip, touching her like she was something miraculous. "Have you ever wanted something you knew you shouldn't have? When did desire overrule logic in your life? Tell me in the comments about the moment you chose passion over prudence. What happened next was inevitable and perfect and completely wrong." His mouth on her skin, her hands learning the planes of his chest, whispered words that sounded like prayers and confessions. When he asked if she was okay, when he checked in with gentle questions and patient pauses, she felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with being seen, being cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the leather sofa, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain and the kind of silence that follows breaking points. "I should go," she said, but made no move to leave the warmth of his arms. "Should you?" His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she felt herself melting into him in ways that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with the dangerous intimacy of being held. "This complicates things," she said. "Everything worthwhile is complicated." She lifted her head to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "Brandon, I know this wasn't planned. I know it's messy and inappropriate and probably a dozen other things that should make us both run in opposite directions. But," he cupped her face with gentle hands, "but I can't regret it. I can't regret this." The words hung between them, honest and terrifying, because she couldn't regret it either, even knowing what she knew, even carrying the secret that would destroy this fragile thing they'd built. As dawn crept through the study windows, painting everything in soft gold, Kendra traced circles on Brandon's chest and tried to find the courage to tell him the truth. About who she really was, about why she'd come here, about the connection between them that ran deeper than either of them understood. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, then stopped. "Because how do you confess to the man you're falling for that everything about your presence in his life began as a carefully constructed lie? How do you tell him that the woman he just made love to was the same woman who'd been in his house the night his wife died? The same woman who'd been there when Elizabeth Marks took her last breath, whispering secrets that could change everything." She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Not yet. Not when he was looking at her like she'd hung the stars. Now, for the first time in 8 years, she felt like she might deserve something good. "What is it?" he asked, brushing her hair back from her face. "Nothing," she lied, hating herself for the deception, but unable to destroy this perfect moment. Nothing important. But as he kissed her forehead and pulled her closer, as they drifted towards sleep wrapped around each other, Kendra knew she was living on borrowed time. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. And when it did, this beautiful, impossible thing between them would shatter like everything else in her life had shattered 8 years ago. Morning has a way of making midnight decisions feel like mistakes, until you realize some mistakes are worth making twice. Kendra woke to sunlight streaming through the study windows and the weight of Brandon's arm across her waist. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the warmth of his body against hers, the way he held her even in sleep like she was something precious. Then reality crashed back. She was naked in her employer's study, wrapped around the man whose wife's secrets she'd been carrying for 8 years. The man whose daughter she was supposed to be helping, not the man she was supposed to be falling for. Carefully, she extracted herself from his arms, gathering her scattered clothes with practiced silence. Brandon stirred but didn't wake, his face peaceful in the morning light. He looked younger like this, without the weight of responsibility and grief he carried during the day. She should feel guilty. She should feel ashamed. Instead, as she slipped back in her tank top and shorts, all she felt was the lingering warmth of his hands on her skin and the dangerous desire to crawl back into his arms. The guest house felt different when she finally made it back. Smaller, lonelier, like it belonged to someone else's life. She showered quickly, washing away the scent of him from her skin while trying to ignore how much she missed it already. By 7 a.m., she was back in the main house, professional mask firmly in place, helping Lila with breakfast like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and pretending otherwise was like trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. Morning, Brandon's voice came from the kitchen doorway, rough with sleep and something that might have been uncertainty. She didn't look up from Lila's scrambled eggs. "Good morning, Mr. Marks." The formal address hit him like a slap. She saw him flinch, saw his jaw tighten as he moved to the coffee maker with careful, deliberate steps. "Daddy, look." Lila held up her fork triumphantly. "I ate all my eggs." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Brandon said. But his eyes were on Kendra, searching her face for some sign of what last night had meant. She gave him nothing. Professional smile, neutral tone, the kind of polite distance she'd perfected over years of working for wealthy families with complicated dynamics. "Lila, would you like to feed the fish after breakfast?" she asked, finally looking at Brandon, but directing her words to his daughter. "Can Daddy come too?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. A family activity. The three of them together like they belonged that way. "If your father has time," Kendra said carefully. "I have time," Brandon said, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with feeding fish. 20 minutes later, they stood by the fountain in the garden, watching Lila scatter food flakes across the water surface. The morning was perfect, warm but not humid, with a breeze that carried the scent of roses and the promise of a beautiful day. It should have been peaceful. Instead, the air crackled with everything they weren't saying. "Kendra," Brandon said quietly while Lila was distracted by a particularly large goldfish. "Don't," she said, not looking at him. "We need to talk about." "There's nothing to talk about." The words came out sharper than she intended. "It was a mistake. It won't happen again." She felt rather than saw him step closer, his presence like gravity pulling at her resolve. "Was it?" he asked. "A mistake?" Finally, she looked at him and nearly lost her composure at what she saw in his eyes. Not anger or wounded pride, but something deeper. Something that looked dangerously like hope. Have you ever tried to convince yourself that the best thing that happened to you was actually the worst? When has fear made you push away exactly what you needed? Drop a comment if you've ever sabotaged your own happiness. "Yes," she lied, hating how the word tasted in her mouth. "You're my employer, Mr. Marks. Lila is my responsibility. Getting involved with you personally compromises my ability to help her." "Does it?" he challenged. Because from where I'm standing, Lila seems happier than she's been since. He stopped himself, but they both knew what he'd almost said. Since her mother died. That has nothing to do with us, Kendra said, but even she could hear how weak it sounded. Doesn't it? She's been watching us, Kendra. Children see everything. She knows something's changed between us, and she's responding to it. She feels safer when the adults in her life care about each other. The observation hit too close to home. Lila had been more affectionate lately, more talkative, more willing to engage. Was it because she sensed the connection between her father and her nanny? Or was it something else entirely? Something Kendra couldn't think about without her chest tightening with panic. Look at me. Pretty fish, Lila called out, completely absorbed in her task. Brandon stepped closer to Kendra, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that her body remembered every touch from the night before. I meant what I said last night, he said softly. I don't regret it. You should. What? Because I'm lying to you, she thought. Because I know things about your wife that would destroy you. Because I came here with an agenda that had nothing to do with helping your daughter and everything to do with my own guilt. Vika. Despite everything, she almost smiled. You like control. There's a difference. Maybe. But I'd give up control if it meant. Don't, she interrupted, stepping back before he could finish the thought. Don't make this more than it was. The words hit him like a physical blow. She watched his face close off, watched him retreat behind the polite mask he wore for business associates and strangers. Of course, he said coolly. My mistake. But as he turned to walk away, Lila looked up from the fountain with bright, happy eyes. Daddy, Kendra, come see. The fish made a heart shape. Sure enough, 2 goldfish had positioned themselves in the water in a way that looked almost intentional, their orange bodies forming a rough heart shape that made Lila clap with delight. Pretty, she declared, then grabbed both their hands, pulling them closer to the fountain's edge. The moment their hands touched, Brandon's larger one, Kendra's smaller one, both wrapped around Lila's tiny fingers. Something shifted, a feeling of rightness, of completion, that made Kendra's throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. This was what family felt like. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. And it was built on a foundation of lies that would crumble the moment Brandon learned the truth about who she really was. Beautiful, Brandon said, but he was looking at them, at her and Lila together, not at the fish. For just a moment, Kendra let herself imagine a world where this could be real, where she could stay, where they could build something lasting, where Lila could have the mother she'd lost, and Kendra could have the family she'd never had. Then reality crashed back, cold and unforgiving. I should get Lila ready for her session with Dr. Patel, she said, gently extracting her hand from their joined grip. Of course, Brandon said, his professional mask sliding back into place. But as she led Lila toward the house, she heard him call her name. Kendra. She turned back, hope and fear warring in her chest. This isn't over, he said simply. The promise, or threat, hung between them as she walked away, knowing he was right. Whatever had started between them last night was bigger than her ability to contain it, stronger than her determination to keep her distance. And that terrified her more than anything else. Because when he finally learned the truth, when he discovered that she'd been there the night Elizabeth died, when he realized that everything about her presence in his life was connected to secrets his wife had died protecting, this fragile beginning would end in exactly the kind of destruction she'd spent 8 years trying to prevent. Running was the only thing she knew how to do perfectly, until the day silence hurt more than staying. For 3 days, Kendra maintained the distance between them with military precision. Professional smiles during staff meetings, polite nods when they passed in the hallways. Conversations that began and ended with Lila's progress, nothing more. She threw herself into work with desperate intensity, designing new activities for Lila, researching trauma recovery techniques, anything to keep her mind occupied and her hands busy. When Brandon was home, she found reasons to take Lila to the far corners of the estate. When he was traveling, she felt his absence like a physical ache she refused to acknowledge. The strategy should have worked. She was good at compartmentalizing, at building walls between what she wanted and what was safe. 8 years of practice had made her an expert at emotional distance. But Lila wasn't cooperating with the plan. "Where's Daddy?" she asked for the third time that morning, looking around the sunroom like he might materialize if she searched hard enough. "He's working, sweetheart. Remember? He had meetings in the city today. But he always says goodbye." The observation hit Kendra like a small blade to the chest. Brandon did always say goodbye to Lila, had since the first week Kendra arrived. But for the past 3 days, he'd been leaving before they came down for breakfast, avoiding the family moments that had become routine. Because of her, because of what had happened between them, and her subsequent retreat behind professional boundaries that felt more like prison walls. "He's been very busy," she said, hating how the excuse sounded even as she offered it. Lila studied her with those two knowing eyes, the kind of perception that made children dangerous witnesses to adult complications. "Are you sad, Kendra?" The question caught her off guard. "What makes you ask that?" You smiled different now, like the smile doesn't go inside. From the mouths of babes, Kendra felt her careful composure crack slightly. "Sometimes grown-ups have to think about difficult things," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean I'm not happy to be here with you." It was true mostly. Being with Lila was the best part of every day. Watching her heal, seeing her personality emerge from behind the walls trauma had built. If Kendra could freeze time, could stay in these moments forever without the complication of Brandon or the weight of her secrets, she would. But life didn't work that way. That afternoon, while Lila napped, Kendra found herself walking the estate grounds with restless energy. The gardens were immaculate as always, every flower bed perfectly maintained, every hedge trimmed with mathematical precision. It was beautiful and lifeless, like a museum exhibit of what wealth could buy. She was sitting by the fountain, watching the goldfish that had made Lila so happy, when her phone buzzed with a text. "Unknown number. We need to talk. Tonight. B." Her hand shook as she read the message. She'd been dreading this conversation and craving it in equal measure, knowing it was inevitable, but hoping she could delay it indefinitely. Have you ever run from something good because it scared you how much you wanted it? Drop a red heart if you've been there. Can't. Lila needs consistency. The response came immediately. "She's sleeping over at Maria's tonight." Her idea. She wanted to sleep over with someone who speaks Spanish. "Don't use my daughter as an excuse to avoid me." The directness of it stole her breath. He knew exactly what she was doing, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. "This is a bad idea. So is hiring you. So is letting you into our lives. So is falling for someone who runs the moment things get real. But here we are, falling for someone." The words hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her heart she tried to keep dark. Because despite everything, the lies, the secrets, the impossible situation, she was falling too. Had been falling since that first night in his study, maybe even before that. "My office, 9 p.m. Don't make me come find you." She stared at the phone for a long time after the conversation ended, torn between the desire to run and the knowledge that she was tired of running. Tired of building walls, tired of keeping people at arm's length, tired of protecting herself from connection by avoiding it entirely. But wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. At 8:30, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, changing clothes for the third time. Nothing felt right. Professional attire seemed ridiculous given what had happened between them, but anything too casual sent the wrong message about her intentions. Finally, she settled on jeans and a soft blue sweater, the kind of outfit that said she was willing to have a real conversation without promising more than she could give. Her apartment felt smaller now, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The space hadn't changed, but she had, and now her carefully constructed world couldn't contain what she'd become. What she wanted. What she was terrified of losing. At 5 minutes to 9, she stood outside Brandon's study, hand raised to knock, paralyzed by indecision. Through the door, she could hear the faint sound of music, something soft and instrumental that made the moment feel more intimate than it should. She could turn around, could text him that she wasn't feeling well, that they could talk tomorrow, that professional distance was the right choice for everyone involved. But as she stood there, frozen between wanting and fear, she heard Lila's voice echoing in her memory. You smile different now. Like the smile doesn't go inside. She didn't want to be someone whose smiles stopped at the surface. Didn't want to be someone who ran from happiness because it might not last. Didn't want to look back in 10 years and wonder what might have been if she'd been brave enough to stay. Before she could change her mind, she knocked. Come in, his voice called, and she heard something in his tone. Relief, maybe, or hope, that made her chest tight with emotions she'd been trying to suppress. The study looked the same as it had 3 nights ago, but everything felt different. Brandon stood by the window, still in his dress shirt but with the sleeves rolled up, tie discarded, hair slightly mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. When he turned to face her, the look in his eyes nearly undid her resolve to keep this conversation strictly professional. You came, he said simply. You didn't give me much choice. There's always a choice, Kendra. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning and possibility and all the reasons she should walk away while she still could. But for the first time in 8 years, she was tired of choosing the safe option. Okay, she said, closing the door behind her. Let's talk. Some conversations change your life, not because of what's said, but because for the first time, you stop hiding from the truth. They didn't sit. Sitting felt too casual for what needed to be said, too intimate given the way electricity seemed to arc between them whenever they got close. Instead, they stood on opposite sides of the study, like negotiators working out terms for a ceasefire. Brandon moved to his desk, pouring 2 glasses of bourbon from a crystal decanter that probably cost more than most people's cars. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, and when he handed her a glass, their fingers brushed with the kind of contact that sent heat shooting up her arm. Talk to me, he said simply. Tell me why you're running. Kendra took a sip of bourbon, letting it burn away some of her carefully constructed defenses. I'm not running. I'm being practical. Bullshit. The blunt word surprised her. In the weeks she'd known him, Brandon had been unfailingly polite, controlled, the kind of man who chose his words with surgical precision. This raw honesty felt dangerous and thrilling. Excuse me. You heard me. You're running, and we both know it. The question is why? What are you so afraid of? The question hit too close to home. She turned away from him, moving to the bookshelf, needing distance to think clearly. But even with her back to him, she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. I'm afraid of hurting Lila, she said finally. She's been through enough trauma without watching the adults in her life complicate things unnecessarily. And that's the only reason. She heard him move closer, felt him stop just behind her. Close enough that his voice was soft near her ear. Close enough that she could smell his cologne and remember exactly how his skin had fell under her hands. What other reason would there be? You tell me. The challenge in his voice made her turn around, and she found herself trapped between the bookshelf and his body, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to lose herself in the intensity of his gaze. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said, but her voice came out breathless rather than firm. We can't be professional when we're like this. Like what? Like we want to tear each other's clothes off instead of having a rational conversation. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw his eyes darken with something that made her pulse race. Is that what you want? He asked, voice dropping to that low rumble that made her knees weak. To tear my clothes off? Heat flooded her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. That's not the point, isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, the point is that we have something real here, something worth fighting for, and you're trying to throw it away because you're scared. Of course I'm scared. The admission burst out of her like a dam breaking. I am terrified. Okay, you want the truth? I'm terrified because I've never felt anything like this before. I'm terrified because I care about you and Lila more than I've ever cared about anything. I'm terrified because I don't know how to do this, how to be part of a family, how to let people depend on me, how to depend on someone else. The words hung between them, raw and honest, and more vulnerable than she'd ever been with anyone. When was the last time you were completely honest with someone about your fears? about what you really wanted. Share your experience below. Brandon's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her cheek with gentle fingers. You think I'm not scared too? You're Brandon Marks. You built a $4 billion company from nothing. You don't get scared. I get terrified, he said simply, every time I look at you and realize how much I want this to work. Every time I see you with Lila and think about what it would mean to lose you. Every time I remember that I swore I'd never let anyone get close enough to hurt me the way Elizabeth's death hurt me. The mention of his wife created a moment of silence that felt heavy with memory and loss. Kendra's chest tightened with guilt she couldn't express, secrets she couldn't share. Brandon, let me finish, he said, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I spent 4 years building walls, keeping everyone at arm's length, telling myself it was safer that way. Then you walked into our lives and broke through every defense I had without even trying. You make me want things I convinced myself I didn't need anymore. What things? Partnership, connection, someone to share the good days and help carry the weight of the bad ones. Someone who sees Lila the way you do, not as broken or damaged, but as whole and perfect and worth fighting for. His words painted a picture of everything she wanted and everything she couldn't have. Not with the truth standing between them like a wall she couldn't tear down. You don't understand, she said, pulling away from his touch even though it felt like cutting off oxygen. There are things about me, about my past. I don't care about your past. You would. You will. Try me. For a moment, she almost did. Almost told him about Elizabeth, about the night she died, about the secrets she'd whispered with her last breath. Almost explained why she'd really come here, what she'd been looking for, what she'd found instead. But courage failed her at the crucial moment. I can't, she whispered. I wish I could, but I can't. Something shifted in his expression, disappointment, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that this conversation wasn't going to end the way either of them wanted. Then what do we do? He asked. Because I can't go back to pretending there's nothing between us. And I can't watch you torture yourself with guilt over something that feels right to both of us. I don't know, she admitted. I've never been in a situation like this before. Neither have I. We'll figure it out together. The simple statement hit her harder than all his passionate declarations. Together, like they were a team, like her problems were his problems, like she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. It's not that simple, she said. But even as she spoke, she felt her walls cracking. It could be, if you let it. He stepped closer again, and this time she didn't back away. Couldn't, with the bookshelf behind her and his eyes holding her captive. Kendra, he said, and her name in his voice was a prayer and a plea. Don't run from this. Don't run from us. When his mouth finally found hers, the kiss tasted like bourbon and possibilities and all the words she couldn't say. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Maybe the truth could wait one more night. Maybe she could have this just for a little while before everything fell apart. Maybe she could stop running long enough to remember what it felt like to be caught. She invited him to her world not as a visitor, but as a challenge. Prove you want me, not just what I represent. The next morning brought clarity that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Kendra awoke in her own bed in the guest house, alone but no longer lonely, with the taste of Brandon's kiss still lingering on her lips and a decision crystallizing in her chest like ice forming on water. She was tired of running, tired of letting fear make her choices, tired of pretending that what existed between them was anything less than extraordinary, but if they were going to do this, really do this, it would be on her terms. She found him in the kitchen at 7 a.m., already dressed for work, coffee mug in hand, scrolling through emails on his phone with the kind of focused intensity that had built his empire. He looked up when she entered, and the heat in his eyes nearly made her lose her nerve. "Good morning," he said carefully, like he wasn't sure which version of her he was getting today. "Good morning." She poured herself coffee, her movements deliberate, controlled. "Lila's still sleeping. We have about 20 minutes before she wakes up." "Okay." His voice carried a question he was afraid to ask. She turned to face him, leaning back against the granite counter, and saw the exact moment he registered her outfit. Not the professional blouses and conservative skirts she usually wore, but jeans that hugged her curves and a fitted red top that made her skin glow. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she said, watching the way his grip tightened on his coffee mug. And you were right. I have been running, but not for the reasons you think." He set down his phone, giving her his complete attention. What reasons? This was the moment. The choice between safety and possibility, between the walls she'd built and the life she wanted. "I'm not running from you," she said, stepping closer. "I'm running from this feeling that you're too good to be true. That men like you don't choose women like me. That if I let myself want this, really want it, it'll disappear the moment you realize I'm not the woman you think I am." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Brandon's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that looked like understanding. "What kind of woman do I think you are?" he asked quietly. "Someone worthy of a billionaire's attention. Someone who fits in your world. Someone who doesn't carry baggage that could fill a warehouse." He moved toward her with deliberate steps, closing the distance until he was close enough to touch. "You want to know what kind of woman I think you are?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met. I think you've survived things that would break most people and came out the other side with enough compassion to heal my daughter when no one else could. I think you're beautiful and brilliant and brave, even when you're scared." The words hit her like sunlight after months of darkness. "Brandon, I'm not finished." His hands came up to frame her face. "I think you're the kind of woman who makes me want to be better than I am. The kind of woman who sees past the money and the reputation to the man underneath. The kind of woman I could love for the rest of my life if you'd let me." Love. The word hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. What's more intimate? Letting someone see your vulnerability or showing them your strength? Comment below with your thoughts. Instead of answering with words, she rose on her toes and kissed him. Not the desperate, urgent kiss of 3 nights ago, but something deeper. A claiming, a promise. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she made a decision that would change everything. "Come to my place tonight," she said. "After Lila's asleep. Let me cook for you." His eyes widened slightly. In the 3 months she'd lived here, she'd maintained strict boundaries about her personal space. The guest house was hers, separate from his world, a sanctuary where she could drop her professional mask and just be Kendra. Inviting him, there was more intimate than sex had been in his study. It was letting him see how she lived when no one was watching. "Are you sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." That evening, after Lila had been tucked into bed with 3 stories and 4 glasses of water and 2 trips to the bathroom, after Brandon had said good night with the kind of lingering kiss that promised more, Kendra stood in her kitchen trying to remember how to breathe normally. She'd prepared carefully. Shrimp and grits with a Louisiana kick, cornbread that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen, wine that had cost more than she'd usually spend on groceries for a week. Candles flickered on every surface, and she'd changed into a dress that made her feel beautiful and powerful. When the knock came at 8:30, she almost didn't answer, almost chickened out, and texted him that she wasn't feeling well, that they should maintain professional boundaries, that this was moving too fast. Instead, she opened the door. Brandon stood on her small porch holding a bouquet of wildflowers that looked nothing like the formal arrangements that filled his mansion. These were cheerful and imperfect and exactly right. "You came," she said, echoing his words from the night before. "You asked me to. I'd have moved mountains to get here." The simple honesty in his voice nearly undid her. She stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how small her space looked compared to his palatial home. 2 bedrooms, a tiny living area, a kitchen barely big enough for one person to cook comfortably. But as Brandon looked around, taking in the colorful throw pillows, the photographs of sunsets and city streets, the books stacked on every available surface, she saw something in his expression that made her chest tight. "This feels like you," he said finally. "Is that good or bad?" "It's perfect. It's warm and real and beautiful. Like coming home." Over dinner, they talked about everything except the obvious tension crackling between them. He told her about growing up in Detroit, about the scholarship that changed his life, about the early days of building his company when failure felt more likely than success. She found herself sharing stories she'd never told anyone. About her childhood in Louisiana, about the grandmother who raised her with iron will and endless love, about the dreams she'd abandoned and the one she was still chasing. "You never talk about your parents," Brandon observed over wine and candlelight. The question hit a nerve she'd thought was buried. "Not much to say. My mother left when I was 6. My father wasn't interested in raising a daughter alone." "I'm sorry. Don't be. My grandmother was better than both of them combined. She taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Because Brandon had shown up. For their conversation, for this dinner, for her. When they moved to her small sofa after dinner, when he pulled her against his side like she belonged there, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. "Thank you," he said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For what? For letting me in? For trusting me with this?" He gestured around her living room, but she knew he meant more than just her space. When she looked up at him, when she saw the way he was looking at her, like she was precious, like she was home, she made another decision that would change everything. "I'm not glass," she said, echoing words she'd spoken once before. "Stop handling me like I'll break." His eyes darkened, and she felt the shift between them like electricity in the air. "Show me what you want," he said, voice rough with restraint and desire. For once in her life, she didn't hesitate. What happened next was inevitable and perfect and completely right. Her mouth on his, her hands learning the planes of his chest, her body taking control in ways that surprised them both. When she straddled his lap, when she kissed him with all the hunger she'd been suppressing, when she whispered exactly what she wanted against his ear, she felt powerful in a way she'd never experienced. This wasn't desperation or need. This was choice. This was claiming what she wanted instead of waiting for permission. Later, tangled together on her sofa with moonlight streaming through gauze curtains, Brandon traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Stay," she said softly. "Tonight, stay with me." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." As he carried her to her bedroom, as they made love again with slow reverence that felt like worship, as they fell asleep wrapped around each other in her small bed, Kendra let herself believe that maybe this could work. Maybe the past could stay buried. Maybe love could be stronger than secrets. Maybe she could have this beautiful, impossible thing without destroying it. But at 3 a.m., her phone rang. The number was one she'd memorized 8 years ago and hoped never to see again. With Brandon sleeping peacefully beside her, with happiness finally within reach, she stared at the screen and felt her carefully constructed world begin to crack. Because the past had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran or how deep you buried it. And some secrets were too big to keep forever. People say love bridges different worlds, but nobody tells you how terrifying it is to stand in the middle, wondering if the bridge will hold. The phone call at 3 a.m. had been a warning shot across the bow of her happiness. A voice from 8 years ago, rough with cigarettes and bad decisions, saying just 5 words, "Time to pay up, Kendra." Then silence. No demands, no threats, no explanation of how they'd found her or what they wanted. Just the promise that her past was coming for her whether she was ready or not. She deleted the voicemail, turned off her phone, and spent the rest of the night watching Brandon sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on his face before everything inevitably fell apart. But morning had a way of making midnight terrors feel manageable. Brandon woke her with coffee and kisses, with soft words about how right this felt, how he'd never slept better than he had in her arms. Looking at him, rumpled and relaxed, and completely hers in the early light, she almost convinced herself that one phone call couldn't destroy what they'd built. 3 weeks later, she was standing in a marble foyer of his Connecticut mansion, watching him straighten his tie before a board meeting, still trying to believe that this domesticity was real, that she belonged in his world of Italian leather and crystal chandeliers, of staff who called her Miss Washington with respectful deference, of a life where wanting something didn't automatically mean losing it. The Peterson account needs our final proposal by Friday, he was saying, scrolling through emails on his phone while she adjusted a collar with the kind of easy intimacy that had developed between them. And the Shanghai office wants to video conference about the new AI protocols. She murmured, only half listening. These morning briefings had become routine. Brandon thinking out loud about his day, while she pretended to understand the complexities of running a tech empire. She was more interested in the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the scent of his cologne that she'd grown addicted to, the simple miracle of being allowed to touch him whenever she wanted. "Are you listening to me?" he asked, but his tone was amused rather than annoyed. "Not really," she admitted, smoothing down his lapels. "I was thinking about how good you look in this suit. Flattery will get you everywhere. I'm hoping it'll give me a kiss before you leave." He obliged immediately, pulling her against him with the kind of easy affection that still surprised her. 3 weeks of this. Of morning kisses and shared dinners, of Brandon working from home more often than not, of Lila's joy at seeing them together, and she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I have something to ask you," Brandon said against her lips. "Ask away." "The company party is next weekend. Annual celebration. Investors, board members, the whole circus. I want you to come with me." The words hit her like cold water. His world, his people, his life beyond the protected bubble of this estate. A place where her face might be recognized, where the wrong person might ask the right questions, where 8 years of careful anonymity could disappear in a single conversation. "As what?" she asked carefully. "As my girlfriend. As the woman I'm falling in love with. As my partner." The words should have thrilled her. Instead, they filled her with the kind of panic that made breathing difficult. Have you ever felt like you were living in 2 different worlds? How did you bridge that gap? Share your experience. "Brandon, I don't think. I know it's a big step," he said, misreading her hesitation. "I know mixing personal and professional is complicated, but I want people to know about us. I want to stop hiding what we have like it's something shameful." "It's not about shame." Then what? How could she explain without explaining everything? How could she tell him that stepping into his public world was like painting a target on her back for people who'd spent 8 years looking for her? "Your world and my world are very different," she said finally. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of scrutiny." "What scrutiny? You're brilliant and beautiful, and you've worked miracles with my daughter. Anyone who has a problem with that can go to hell." His fierce protectiveness should have been comforting. Instead, it reminded her how much she had to lose if the truth came out. Not just her own carefully constructed life, but his reputation, his peace of mind, his ability to remember his late wife without the shadow of scandal. "I need to think about it," she said. Something shifted in his expression, disappointment, maybe, or the beginning of doubt. "What's there to think about? Either you want to be part of my life or you don't. It's not that simple. It could be, if you'd let it." Before she could respond, Lila came bouncing into the foyer, pigtails flying, backpack dragging behind her. "Daddy, Kendra, look what I drew." She thrust a piece of construction paper at them. A child's drawing of 3 figures holding hands outside a big house. A man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling under a yellow crayon sun. "It's our family," Lila announced proudly. The word hit Kendra like a physical blow. Family. The thing she'd wanted her entire life. The thing she'd never dared to hope for. Drawn in purple and green crayon by a 4-year-old who'd claimed her as surely as if she'd been born to this. Brandon's arm tightened around her waist, and when she looked up at him, she saw everything she felt reflected in his eyes. Love, hope, terror, and the bone-deep knowledge that they were standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of their lives. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said to Lila, but his eyes never left Kendra's face. "Can we put on the refrigerator?" Lila asked. "Of course we can," Kendra managed, her voice only slightly unsteady. As they walked to the kitchen together, Brandon carrying his briefcase, Lila skipping between them. Kendra holding a drawing that represented everything she wanted and everything she was afraid of losing. She tried to convince herself that this could work. That love could overcome lies. That the family they'd built could survive the truth about how she'd come to be part of it. That the phone call at 3 a.m. had been an empty threat from people who'd moved on with their lives. But when they reached the kitchen, when Brandon kissed her goodbye with the kind of tenderness that promised forever, when Lila hugged her legs and whispered, "I love you," Kendra, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she felt the weight of her secrets like a physical presence. The truth was coming. She could feel it in the way shadows seemed longer lately, in the way she'd started checking over her shoulder when she drove into town, in the way her phone seemed to ring more often with numbers she didn't recognize. And when it arrived, when the past finally caught up with the present, this beautiful, fragile thing they'd built would shatter like everything else in her life had shattered 8 years ago. Unless she found the courage to tell Brandon the truth herself. But how do you tell the man you love that everything he knows about you is a lie? How do you confess that you came into his life carrying secrets about his dead wife that could destroy his memory of her? How do you risk losing everything for the sake of honesty when dishonesty is the only thing that's kept you alive? As she watched Brandon's car disappear down the circular drive, as she felt Lila's small hand slip into hers, as she stared at the drawing that showed them as the family she'd always dreamed of being, Kendra made a decision that would change everything. She would tell him, tonight, after Lila was asleep, after they'd shared dinner and conversation and the kind of easy intimacy that had become their routine. She would tell him about Elizabeth, about the night she died, about the secret she'd whispered with her last breath. She would risk everything for the chance at a real future built on truth instead of lies. Because the alternative, waiting for the past to destroy the present, was worse than any truth she could tell, even if that truth ended everything. What if the person you trusted most was the one person who could destroy everything you've built? Brandon found her in Lila's room at midnight, packing, not hastily, not frantically, but with the careful precision of someone who had always known this moment would come. Going somewhere, his voice carried none of the warmth from earlier, just cold executive authority. Kendra didn't look up from folding Lila's favorite pajamas into a small bag. Your company party is tomorrow night. You need someone who can handle that world. I need you to handle it. No, she finally met his eyes. You need someone who doesn't come with 8 years of secrets attached. Have you ever watched someone you love prepare to disappear? The way they touch familiar objects like they're saying goodbye. That's what Brandon was seeing now, and it terrified him more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. The phone call this morning, he said. Who was it? Kendra's hands stilled on a small drawing Lila had made. Stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Someone from my past. Someone who knows why I really came here. Tell me. She sat on the edge of Lila's bed, the same spot where she'd held his daughter that first night, where everything had started to change between them. Your wife didn't die in a car accident, Brandon. The words hit him like physical blows. What did you say? Elizabeth. She didn't die the way you think she did. Brandon's world tilted. For years of grief, for years of building his life around that single devastating moment. And now this woman he'd fallen in love with, was telling him it was all wrong? You're lying. I wish I was. Kendra's voice broke just slightly. I was there that night, in the house, with her. Do you know what it feels like when the foundation of your reality cracks? When every truth you've built your life on suddenly feels like quicksand beneath your feet. Brandon stepped back, his mind racing. You worked for us before, under another name, Kendra Williams. I was Elizabeth's friend, her confidant. Hello. The word hung between them like a blade. Brandon felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. That's impossible. Elizabeth wasn't. She was questioning everything about her life, about your marriage, about what she really wanted. Kendra stood, moving closer despite the danger in his eyes. She was going to leave you, Brandon. She was going to take Lila and start over. Stop talking. The night she died, we were together, planning our future. All three of us, me, her, and Lila. We were going to be a family. Brandon's hands were shaking now. You're sick. This is some twisted fantasy. She kissed me in your kitchen while you were in Tokyo. She told me she'd never felt more alive than when she was with me. She said loving me felt like breathing for the first time. Shut up. But Kendra wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not now that the truth was finally bleeding out of her. The accident wasn't random, Brandon. Elizabeth got that call. The one telling her about your plane being delayed. She was upset, crying, because it meant another night of pretending. Another night of living a lie. She drove to the overlook where we used to meet. She called me, said she couldn't do it anymore. She was going to tell you everything when you got home. Brandon's face had gone white. You're lying. She drove off that cliff because she was running to me, not away from you. The police found her phone. The last number she called was mine. The silence that followed felt like the end of the world. Brandon stared at this woman he thought he knew, this woman who'd brought his daughter back to life, this woman he'd made love to just hours ago. And all he could see was betrayal. All he could feel was rage. Get out. Brandon, get out of my house. Kendra flinched but didn't move. Lila needs me. My daughter needs to be protected from people like you. People who lie. People who manipulate grieving families for their own sick purposes. I came here to help her heal. To help you both heal. You came here to finish what you started. To destroy what's left of my family. Have you ever seen love turn to hate in real time? It's like watching something beautiful burn, knowing you can't put out the flames. Kendra picked up her bag, moving toward the door. But she stopped in the doorway, her back to him. The drawing Lila made today, the 3 stick figures, she drew it because she remembers me from before, from when her mother was happy, when all of us were happy. You're delusional. Ask yourself why she spoke for the first time when she saw me. Ask yourself why the word was mommy. Because somewhere, the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Brandon stood alone in his daughter's room, surrounded by toys and drawings and the ghost of everything he thought he knew about his life. Tomorrow night, he would stand in front of investors and present his company's future. But tonight, his own future had just walked out the door, taking all his certainties with her. What do you do when the person you love most becomes the person you hate most in a single conversation? Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it burns your whole world down. Brandon found himself in his study at 3 a.m., staring at a bottle of whiskey he hadn't touched in 4 years. Not since Elizabeth's funeral. Not since he'd promised himself he'd be strong for Lila. But strength felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. Have you ever had a night where every certainty in your life crumbled? Where every happy memory suddenly felt like a lie? He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a number he hadn't called since those first dark months after Elizabeth's death. Detective Morrison, the man who'd handled the investigation. Morrison, it's Brandon Marks. I need to ask you about my wife's case. A pause. Papers rustling. Mr. Marks, it's 3 in the morning. Is everything all right? The night Elizabeth died. Her phone records. Who was the last person she called? Sir, we went over this 4 years ago. The case is closed. I'm asking you to look again. Another pause. Longer this time. Hold on. Brandon waited, the whiskey burning a path down his throat. Outside his window, Connecticut looked peaceful, orderly. Nothing like the chaos inside his head. Mr. Marks? The last call was to a number registered to Kendra Williams. Duration, 14 minutes. That call ended approximately 10 minutes before the accident. The glass slipped from Brandon's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. Did you interview her? We tried to. She'd left town the day after the accident. No forwarding address. We attempted to locate her for weeks, but eventually had to close that line of inquiry. Brandon's mind was reeling. What did she tell Elizabeth during that call? Mr. Marks, I can't speculate about private conversations. My wife is dead, detective. I have a right to know. A long sigh. The cell tower data showed your wife was parked at Sunset Overlook for nearly an hour before the accident. That's not consistent with someone driving home from dinner with friends like she told you she was doing. What are you saying? I'm saying your wife lied about where she was that night. And the woman she called right before she died disappeared immediately afterward. If you found Kendra Williams, Mr. Marks, you need to be very careful. The line went dead. Brandon sat in his destroyed study, surrounded by broken glass and broken truths, trying to piece together a story that made sense. Elizabeth hadn't been coming home from dinner with girlfriends. She'd been at Sunset Overlook, their place, the spot where he'd proposed to her 7 years ago, talking to Kendra Williams for 14 minutes. 14 minutes before she drove off a cliff. Do you know what betrayal tastes like? It tastes like copper and regret and the bitter aftertaste of every kiss that was never really yours. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The party tomorrow night. She'll be there. If you want the whole truth, don't let your security stop her from coming. A friend. Brandon stared at the message until the screen went dark, reflecting his own haunted face back at him. Upstairs, Lila was sleeping peacefully in her room, surrounded by drawings and stuffed animals and all the innocent trappings of childhood. She had no idea that the woman who'd finally helped her speak was the same woman who'd helped destroy their family 4 years ago. Brandon made his way to his daughter's room, standing in the doorway like he had so many nights since Elizabeth's death. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was seeing everything through new eyes. The way Lila had responded to Kendra that first night. The immediate trust. The words she'd spoken, Mommy, not Nanny, or even Kendra. Had his 4-year-old daughter recognized something he'd missed? Some memory from before the accident? He moved closer to Lila's bed, studying the drawings taped to her wall. Most were typical kid stuff, rainbows and flowers and stick figure families. But there was one he hadn't noticed before. 3 figures holding hands. A tall one with dark hair, a smaller one with lighter hair, and a tiny one in the middle. And at the bottom, in Lila's careful 4-year-old handwriting, my family. But the drawing wasn't new. The paper was old, creased, like it had been folded and carried and treasured, like it had been drawn 4 years ago. Brandon's hands were shaking as he studied the picture more closely. In the background, barely visible in crayon, was a house. Not this house in Connecticut, their old house in New York. The house where they'd lived before Elizabeth died. Have you ever realized that your child has been trying to tell you something for years, but you weren't listening? Lila had remembered. Somehow, in her 4-year-old mind, she'd held onto memories of a time when Kendra was part of their family, when her mother was happy, when the 3 of them had been planning a future together. Brandon sat heavily in the rocking chair where Kendra had held his daughter that first night, where she'd coaxed the first word from Lila's lips in 4 years. Tomorrow night, his company would go public. Investors would celebrate. Champagne would flow. Success would be measured in dollars and market caps and quarterly projections. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the truth. All of it. Even the parts that would destroy him. Especially the parts that would destroy him. Because somewhere in this mess of lies and betrayal and impossible love, his daughter had found her voice again. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than everything else he thought he'd lost. What would you sacrifice to give your child back their voice? Even if it meant losing everything else you thought you wanted? Sometimes the biggest lies are the ones we tell ourselves about who we really are. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom glittered with 500 of New York's most powerful people, all gathered to celebrate MindNet's historic IPO launch. Brandon stood at the center of it all in his custom Armani tuxedo, accepting congratulations and handshakes, playing the role of a successful tech mogul. But inside, he felt like he was drowning. Have you ever had a smile and make small talk while your world was falling apart? It's like performing surgery on yourself while pretending everything's fine. Brandon, his business partner David, approached with 2 investors in tow. The Yamamoto Group wants to discuss expanding into the Asian markets. Brandon shook hands, said the right words, performed the dance he perfected over years of corporate events. But his eyes kept scanning the crowd, looking for one face. She wouldn't come. Not after last night. Not after the things he'd said. But that text message had been clear. She'll be there. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to check on something. Brandon made his way through the crowd toward the main entrance, past clusters of venture capitalists and tech journalists, past waiters carrying champagne and executives discussing market valuations. That's when he saw her. Kendra stood in the doorway, wearing a black dress that hugged every curve he'd memorized with his hands just 2 nights ago. Her hair was pulled back, elegant and professional, but there was something in her posture that screamed defiance. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to finish what she'd started. Do you know what it feels like to see someone who's broken your heart looking absolutely stunning? It's like being stabbed with a knife made of starlight. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. The noise of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the soft jazz music, all of it faded into background static. Brandon moved toward her, navigating through clusters of suits and evening gowns, his heart pounding harder than it had during any business presentation. You came. You asked for the truth. The whole truth. Kendra's voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Are you ready for it? Before he could answer, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. 3 men in expensive suits were arguing with security, demanding entry. Problem, Mr. Marks? His head of security approached. I don't know those men, but Kendra did. Brandon could see it in the way her face went pale, the way she took an involuntary step backward. They're here for me, she said quietly. Who are they? Elizabeth's family, her brother Marcus and her cousins. They've been looking for me for 4 years. The pieces clicked into place. The mysterious phone call yesterday morning. The text about the party. Someone had orchestrated this confrontation. But who? Mr. Marks. A woman's voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the ambient noise. Brandon turned to see a tall, striking woman in her 50s approaching. Designer dress, perfect makeup, the kind of confidence that came with serious money. Victoria Ashford, she extended her hand. I was Elizabeth's best friend. The name hit him like ice water. He remembered Victoria from the funeral. Beautiful, composed, speaking about Elizabeth's kindness and generosity. What he hadn't known was that Victoria had been watching, waiting, planning. I think it's time everyone knew the real story about that night 4 years ago. Victoria continued, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby conversations to slow, for heads to turn. Victoria, don't. Kendra's voice was barely a whisper. Don't what? Don't tell him how you seduced his wife. Don't explain how you convinced her to leave her family. Don't describe the phone call where you told her to meet you that night. The ballroom was getting quieter. People were starting to stare. Brandon felt trapped between rage and humiliation, between the woman he'd loved and lost, and the woman he'd found and might lose again. You want the truth, Brandon? Victoria's voice was getting louder, more theatrical. Your wife was going to leave you for the nanny. She was going to take your daughter and disappear into some fantasy life with a woman who saw dollar signs instead of love. Stop. Brandon's voice cracked like a whip. But Victoria was just getting started. The night she died, Kendra told her to run away, to abandon her responsibilities, her commitments, her marriage vows. Elizabeth was driving to meet her when she went off that cliff. She died running away from you and toward her. Have you ever been humiliated in front of 500 people? It feels like being skinned alive while everyone watches and pretends not to enjoy the show. The ballroom had gone almost silent now. Phones were coming out. Videos were being recorded. Tomorrow, this would be all over social media, all over the business press. But that's not the worst part, Victoria continued, her voice carrying a cruel satisfaction. The worst part is that she came back. 4 years later, she came back to finish what she started, to take your daughter away from you, just like she took your wife. That's not true. Kendra's voice was stronger now, cutting through the whispers and shocked gasps. I came back to help Lila heal, to help them both heal. By lying about who you were, by seducing him just like you seduced his wife. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Brandon looked at Kendra, really looked at her, standing there in front of 500 strangers being stripped bare and humiliated. And suddenly, he realized something that changed everything. She wasn't defending herself. She was protecting him, protecting Lila. Even now, even facing public destruction, she was trying to shield them from the worst of the scandal. That wasn't the behavior of a manipulator or a gold digger. That was the behavior of someone who loved them, both of them, enough to sacrifice herself for their reputation. What would you do if you realized you'd been wrong about everything just as it was too late to fix it? Sometimes love isn't about getting what you want. Sometimes it's about choosing what's right, even when it destroys you. Brandon stepped forward, placing himself between Kendra and Victoria's vicious words. The ballroom fell silent. 500 pairs of eyes focused on the tech mogul who'd just seen his private life exploded in public. You're right, he said, his voice carrying across the room. My wife was planning to leave me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones captured every word. She was unhappy in our marriage. She'd found someone who made her feel alive in ways I never could. And yes, that someone was Kendra. Kendra stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. This wasn't what she'd expected. This wasn't protection. This was professional suicide. But you're wrong about why she came back. Brandon turned to face the crowd, his voice growing stronger. She didn't come back to destroy my family. She came back to heal my daughter. Have you ever watched someone sacrifice everything they've built for the person they love? It's the most beautiful and terrifying thing you'll ever see. My daughter hadn't spoken in 4 years. Not since the accident. Specialists, therapists, behavioral experts, no one could reach her. But Kendra did. In one night, she gave my daughter her voice back. The crowd was mesmerized now. This wasn't the scandal they'd expected. This was raw truth, painful and honest. So yes, my wife loved someone else. Yes, she was planning to leave me. And yes, I fell in love with the same woman. But love isn't always convenient. It isn't always clean. Sometimes it's messy and complicated, and it breaks your heart before it heals it. Brandon turned back to Kendra, his eyes never leaving hers. I said terrible things to you last night. I accused you of manipulation, of lying, of using my grief against me. I was wrong. Brandon, don't do this, Kendra whispered. Your company, your reputation. My company will survive. My reputation will recover. But if I let you walk out of here thinking you're the villain in this story, I'll never forgive myself. Victoria stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. She's a predator, Brandon. She destroys marriages. She loved my wife. Brandon's voice cut through her protests. And my wife loved her. That doesn't make either of them villains. It makes them human. Do you know what courage looks like? It looks like a man standing in front of 500 investors and destroying his carefully crafted image because love matters more than money. Elizabeth's death was an accident, a tragedy, but it wasn't anyone's fault. She was driving to make a choice about her future, and sometimes life doesn't give us time to make those choices. Brandon moved closer to Kendra, close enough to touch her face, to wipe away the tears she was trying not to shed. But I do have time. I have time to choose what matters. I have time to choose love over fear, truth over reputation, family over everything else. Your daughter, Victoria, tried one last attack. My daughter adores her. My daughter remembers her from before, and she's been waiting 4 years for her to come back. Children don't lie about love. They don't pretend affection for ulterior motives. Brandon took Kendra's hands in his, right there in front of everyone. I don't care about the past. I don't care about what might have been. I care about what is, what could be, if you'll have us. Kendra was crying now, not caring about her makeup or her professional composure. You don't understand what you're giving up, she whispered. I understand exactly what I'm choosing. You, Lila, a family built on truth instead of secrets. Have you ever seen a room full of powerful people realize they're witnessing something more important than money? The silence was complete, reverential, almost. I love you, Brandon said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. I love you for loving my wife when I couldn't. I love you for loving my daughter when everyone else gave up. I love you for coming back, even knowing it might destroy you. I love you too, Kendra whispered, but in the silence, everyone heard. Then marry me. The words came out before he'd planned them, before he'd thought them through. But they felt right. They felt inevitable. Marry me and help me raise Lila. Help me build something real, something honest, something worth more than any IPO or market valuation. Kendra stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She looked around the ballroom, at the phones recording their most private moment, at the investors who just watched their business partner have a very public breakdown. Then she looked back at Brandon, at the man who just sacrificed his carefully controlled image for love. Yes, the ballroom erupted, not in scandal or whispers, but in applause. Slow at first, then building, until 500 of New York's most cynical people were celebrating a love story that had taken 4 years and countless mistakes to reach this moment. Victoria stood in the corner, her face pale with defeat. She'd come to destroy them, but instead had given them the push they needed to choose each other publicly, completely, without reservation. Sometimes the people trying to hurt you end up saving you instead. Brandon kissed Kendra right there in front of everyone, and for the first time in 4 years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. What would you risk for a love that heals instead of hurts? For a family built on truth instead of convenience? 6 months later, Brandon stood in the kitchen of their new house. Not the marble palace in Connecticut, but a warm, lived-in home in Westchester where Lila could have a backyard and Kendra could have a garden. Love, he learned, wasn't about grand gestures and ballrooms. It was about Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories and the sound of his daughter laughing in the next room. "Daddy, come see." Lila's voice rang through the house, clear and confident and absolutely perfect. He found them in the living room. Kendra sitting cross-legged on the floor, Lila beside her, both of them surrounded by photo albums and loose pictures. "What you two up to?" "We're making a storybook," Lila announced proudly. "About our family. All of it." Brandon sat down beside them, looking at the photos spread across the coffee table. Pictures of him and Elizabeth from their early days. Photos of Lila as a baby. And newer ones, Kendra teaching Lila to ride a bike, all 3 of them at the beach last month, candid shots from their quiet wedding ceremony. "This was Mommy Elizabeth." Lila pointed to a photo of Elizabeth holding her as an infant. "She loved me first." "She did," Kendra agreed softly. "And this is Mommy Kendra," Lila continued, pointing to a recent photo. "She loves me now." Have you ever seen a child's wisdom solve problems that adults complicate? Lila had figured out what took the grown-ups years to understand. Love isn't finite. Love doesn't run out. Love expands. "And this is Daddy," Lila giggled, pointing to a photo of Brandon covered in flour from their disastrous attempt at making cookies. "He loves us both, but he's bad at baking." "Very bad at baking," Kendra laughed, reaching over to brush a strand of hair from Lila's face. Brandon watched them together, his daughter and his.
The company had survived the scandal, actually thrived because of it. Investors, it turned out, preferred CEOs who chose authenticity over image management. The stock price had soared, but more importantly, his family had survived, had grown, had become something stronger than what they'd lost. "Tell me the story again," Lila requested, settling between them like she did every night. "Which story?" Kendra asked, though she already knew. "The story about how you found us." It was Lila's favorite bedtime tale. The true story of how Kendra had come back into their lives. How love had found a way despite grief and secrets and misunderstandings. "Once upon a time," Kendra began, "there was a little girl who forgot how to use her voice. That was me," Lila whispered, playing her part in their family ritual. "And there was a daddy who forgot how to smile. That was me," Brandon added, pulling them both closer. "And there was a woman who forgot how to hope. That was you, Mommy Kendra." But then something magical happened. They found each other, and when they did, the little girl remembered her voice, the daddy remembered his smile, and the woman remembered how to hope. And they lived happily ever after, Lila concluded with satisfaction. "They did," Kendra agreed. "But not because everything was perfect, because they chose to love each other through the imperfect parts." Do you know what happily ever after really means? It doesn't mean nothing ever goes wrong. It means you face whatever goes wrong together. Later that night, after Lila was asleep, Brandon and Kendra sat on their back porch, watching the stars appear over their quiet suburban neighborhood. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question that had become their evening ritual. "Just one," Kendra said, curling into his arms. "What's that?" "I wish Elizabeth could see this. See how happy Lila is. See that her daughter has everything she dreamed of. 2 parents who love her completely, a home filled with laughter, a future full of possibilities." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his first wife, about the woman who'd given him Lila and inadvertently led him to Kendra. "I think she can," he said finally. "I think she's been watching over us this whole time, making sure we found our way to each other." "You think she planned this?" "Even from the beginning. I think Elizabeth loved us both enough to want us to be happy, even if she couldn't be here to see it. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about honoring it while building something new. Inside their house, their daughter slept peacefully, dreaming of pancakes and bike rides and bedtime stories that always ended with love winning. Some stories don't have neat endings. They don't tie up every loose thread or answer every question. But the best stories, the true ones, end with hope. With family. With the promise that tomorrow will be better than today, because love makes everything possible, even when it seems impossible. Especially then, what would your happily ever after look like if you were brave enough to choose love over fear?